Here are 9 league-winning moves that I think you need to make immediately in 2024 fantasy football. There are players that can help you dominate the fantasy playoffs this season, and there are other moves that will help you dominate the fantasy playoffs this season that you need to make as soon as possible before it's too late. So let's break it all down. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 11 NFL Pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code DCATCH, that link is down below, a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 11's action. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users to Underdog who sign up with promo code DCATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code DCATCH. All right, let's start the video off by talking about Malik Nabers of the Giants, an absolutely must buy low candidate right now, sitting as the wide receiver 14 so far on the season, coming off of a very disappointing game against the Carolina Panthers, where he had just 10.8 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 50 receiving yards. Now, he did have the concussion evaluation in this game. Has some fantasy managers concerned because obviously Nabers had the concussion in week 4 against the Cowboys that kept him out for 2 weeks, but he was able to return to the game and has not popped up on any type of injury report, although the Giants are on bye week here in week 11. Nonetheless, we have to look at the remaining strength of schedule here. But before we do, we also have to mention the fact that Daniel Jones is likely out as the starting quarterback for the New York Giants. Not confirmed, but likely, which would mean that the Giants are going to go to Drew Lock at the quarterback position. Do I think that really changes things for Nabers? Not really, because it's not like Daniel Jones has been good, and Nabers is still going to be the clear-cut option for volume here. So I'm not concerned about it, but what I am concerned about is the fact that people want to just move on from Nabers like he's nothing, right? When he's a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy, and he is one of the best, if not the best, overall remaining strength of schedule on the entire season, not just the fantasy playoffs. Week 12, he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Week 13, the Dallas Cowboys. Week 14, the New Orleans Saints. Then, as you see on the screen in the fantasy playoffs, the Ravens, the Falcons, and the Colts. Every single team he's facing after the bye week is a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. Malik Nabers is a must trade for player right now, and he's going to be a player that we can start on a week in, week out basis for the remainder of the season, and he's absolutely a player that could help you dominate and win the fantasy playoffs. So go out and trade for Malik Nabers while this buy low window is still presenting itself. Another player that I'm going out and I'm trying to aggressively trade for is Calvin Ridley, and obviously he's not going to be a buy low as he's coming off of his best fantasy performance on the season with 25.4 fantasy points, and he's had 12.3 or more fantasy points in every game in the absence of DeAndre Hopkins. But overall, once again, a very strong remaining strength of schedule here. The Minnesota Vikings, the Houston Texans, the Commanders, a little bit tough, but not awful. The Jaguars, the Bengals, the Colts, and then the Jaguars. Again, I mean, this is such a strong strength of schedule through the fantasy playoffs. It's almost ridiculous, but Houston's a great matchup. Minnesota this weekend is a great matchup. He gets Jacksonville in week 14 as well. So overall, Calvin Ridley, a player that I'm trying to aggressively trade for because I think he's going to help make a push into the fantasy playoffs and then help dominate the fantasy playoffs as well. Now, the Titans not going to be one of these teams like looking to fight for a strong playoff spot or anything like that. But they're also one of these teams that are trying to figure out what do we have for the future for next season? What is Will Levis going to actually give us at the quarterback position? And I think we're going to see them stay competitive towards the end of the season. Maybe not in the same way we're going to see some other teams fighting for playoff spots and seeding and all that stuff be competitive, but I do think that they're still going to put up competitive overall game script. So I'm not worried about that. And Ridley has been fantastic in the role as a true wide receiver one with no DeAndre Hopkins on this team. Plus, he had that really strong game this past week, some of it in garbage time, I know, but still a very strong performance with Will Levis at quarterback. It didn't matter that it wasn't Mason Rudolph at quarterback. So Ridley, a player that I'm chasing due to his upcoming schedule, a player that I think could help you guys absolutely win and dominate your league. Another wide receiver that I'm trying to trade for right now while there's a buy low window is Mike Evans, and we know he's going to more than likely return in week 12. Of course, that's not confirmed yet. That's just his target return time. Overall, Mike Evans, this is a great buy low window. He's been hurt. He's been out for weeks. The Bucs are coming off a not so strong performance, and people are just throwing away Mike Evans in trades with a very low overall perceived value. But don't forget, he was playing very well when healthy. He had double-digit fantasy performances in 3 out of 6 games before he was hurt in week 7, and he was in line for another double-digit fantasy day if he had stayed healthy against the Baltimore Ravens in week 7. So I like Mike Evans a lot. He's got a very strong schedule coming out of the bye against the Giants and the Panthers. It's a little bit tough in weeks 14 and 15 against the Raiders and against the Chargers, but we have seen some games in which wide receiver ones have played well against the Chargers. Talk about that in a little bit here. And then ultimately he gets the Dallas Cowboys and the Carolina Panthers. Now, the Panthers, in an interesting fashion, have moved up a little bit in terms of their strength against wide receivers. And now we're seeing the Cowboys definitely bend a little bit. Overall, neither of those teams scare me, especially in weeks 16 and 17, even though they rank 18th and 15th against wide receivers at this point in time, respectfully. But at the end of the day, once we're getting into that stretch there in week 16 and 17, the Buccaneers will probably still be pushing for a wild card spot and be looking to have as much competitiveness in those games as possible. So I really think that Mike Evans is going to, of course, be the strongest candidate to have a big game at the wide receiver position at that point in the season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So while the matchups on screen don't look as strong here, I would not be surprised if the Cowboys and the Panthers fall back in overall ranking by week 16 and 17. And even if they don't, this is Mike Evans. It doesn't concern me unless he's playing like Pat Surtain or Marshawn Lattimore, which he won't be in those two matchups. So the point being is that Mike Evans will be a strong wide receiver one for a team making a playoff push. He was perfectly fine before he got injured, and right now there's a great buy low window on him. I think he could help you guys win your leagues. Go out and trade for Mike Evans while you still can. Speaking of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I also am going to encourage you guys to go out and trade for Bucky Irving or Rachaad White, or if you're feeling frisky, go out and try and trade for both. Now, they're both coming off of strong performances. Last time we saw them in week 10, 17.7 fantasy points to Bucky Irving, 19 fantasy points to Rachaad White, both of them getting involved in the passing game and on the ground. A little bit more on the ground for Bucky, a little bit more in the passing game for Rachaad White, receiving touchdown for Rachaad White, a rushing touchdown for Bucky Irving. But ultimately, the Buccaneers just have a very strong strength of schedule through the fantasy playoffs and 2 really strong matchups right out of the bye week against the Giants and the Panthers. But more specifically, in terms of run defenses that they face in the fantasy playoffs, we have a fantastic stretch. If you're looking at the screen, yeah, once again, it's a little bit tough there in week 15 against the LA Chargers, but we take that out from weeks 12 through 17. The Giants, the Panthers, the Raiders, Chargers, the Cowboys, and the Panthers once again. All those matchups, excluding the Chargers, are bottom 10 units against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed. But what we really want to look at, week 16 and 17, the semifinal and the fantasy championship, you're getting 2 of the absolute worst defenses, not just in recent weeks, but stretching back to week 1 on the season in the entire NFL, in the Dallas Cowboys and the Carolina Panthers. So if you own Bucky or Rachaad White, don't let these players go. And if you don't own them, go out and try and trade for them. I always talk about trading for players on their bye weeks. Their perceived value is a little bit lower, and it'll be a little bit lower coming out of their bye week as well. But Bucky Irving and Rachaad White can both absolutely be league winners that you need to trade for right now. All right, and another running back that we've talked about as of late that I think is going to be a league winner is Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers on bye week right now. So another player to go out and try and trade for while that perceived value is a little bit lower. And Jacobs has been fantastic. He's averaged double-digit fantasy points per game through the entire season. He's a top 15 running back on the season. And overall, he has a very strong schedule for the playoffs. The Seattle Seahawks giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to running backs. Then the New Orleans Saints giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the running back position. And then he finishes with a tough matchup in week 17. But I've talked about this in recent weeks. I still like this matchup because we should be getting a strong game script against the Minnesota Vikings. We could see both of these teams be duking it out for playoff seeding. So I think that defense could go out the window here, and Jacobs is still going to get those red zone carries. So I don't worry too much about that week 17 matchup. So Jacobs, just one of these players, like overall, people are like, I'll trade Josh Jacobs, whatever. I don't really understand it. I know he hasn't had a crazy ceiling on the season with 20 or more fantasy points just twice, but he's been extremely consistent. He's given you double digits every game on the season except for week 3 against the Tennessee Titans when Malik Willis was taking all of the rushing volume there. But overall, I love this playoff schedule for Josh Jacobs, and the Packers are going to be one of these teams definitely towards the end of the season, really, really trying to duke it out for true playoff seeding. So the game scripts are going to be positive as well. While we're on this bye week, and technically Jacobs is dealing with a quad injury, which I'm not going to freak out about, but those two things are going to help you be able to buy Josh Jacobs low. And overall in the season, I've just seen his perceived value be a little bit lower to a lot of fantasy managers. So go out, get Josh Jacobs now. He could absolutely help you win your fantasy league. All right, for those of you who play in leagues with defensive teams, you need to take a strong look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Yes, we've talked about this team a lot through today's video, and we're going to keep talking about them. Coming out of the bye week, they have one of the best overall strength of schedules, not through the fantasy playoffs. I mean, they have a great schedule through the fantasy playoffs, but overall on the remainder of the season. Week 12, they get the New York Giants and whoever's going to be the quarterback there. Week 13, the Carolina Panthers, who've looked a little bit better, but still a great offense to stream against. Week 14, they get the Raiders, Gardner Minshew, one of the best overall teams to stream defensive units against on the season. Week 15, not great against the Chargers, but that's just one game. Then week 16, they get Cooper Rush, Trey Lance, whoever's alive for the Cowboys. Then week 17, they get the Panthers at home. This is a fantastic overall strength of schedule. Now, I have not been a fan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense on the season from a fantasy perspective at all. They had a good performance in week 4, a good performance in week 6. Other than that, they've been very bad. They're the defense 22 so far on the season, but this strength of schedule is too good to ignore. Even if you just pick up the Bucs, put them on your bench, hold out, see what kind of happens, this strength of schedule is fantastic, and they could literally have double-digit performances in almost all of these matchups. So if you play in a league with defensive special teams, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are on bye week sitting at just 28% rostered. They are a defense that we have to take a strong look at that could help push you over the edge and win your fantasy league this year. And another defense that you guys need to take a very strong look at is the Arizona Cardinals. Coming out of the bye week, it's a little bit tough with Seattle twice and Minnesota, but I think they could still make some impressive defensive efforts in those games. But what we want to look at is their strength of schedule through the fantasy playoffs. Drake May at home, who hasn't been awful, but has still had some turnovers on the season. Then at the Carolina Panthers and at the LA Rams. A very strong overall strength of schedule here. And the Cardinals defense quietly has been very good over the past couple weeks with 13 fantasy points in 2 straight games, coming in as a top 15 defense so far on the season. The last time they played the Rams, they had 12 fantasy points, and we've seen the Rams do some things, don't get me wrong, but they've also not looked so great like they did this past week against the Miami Dolphins. So I like the Cardinals as a strong playoff defense. You maybe don't need to go ahead and add them right now, but if you want to stash them, I'm okay with that if you can afford to do so. They sit at just 7% rostered coming off of 2 very strong performances, and they're going to have some very strong performances through the fantasy playoffs as well. So at the very least, keep a strong eye on them going into the fantasy playoffs. And I will say, playing Geno Smith twice between weeks 12 and 14, and Sam Darnold, who looks like he's been seeing ghosts lately, and week 13, they might have strong fantasy performances in that stretch coming out of the bye as well. So Arizona Cardinals, another defense to keep a close eye on that could turn into a true league winner here in 2024. And I'm going to say it one more time. I still think you need to go out and buy low on Breece Hall, who has a fantastic strength of schedule through the playoffs, facing the Jacksonville Jaguars, the LA Rams, and the Buffalo Bills. We have 2 of the worst run defenses in the NFL in that stretch with the Jags and the Bills. The Rams were kind of close to that bunch, ranking in the bottom 10, bottom 12 for most of the season, but they have moved up. Don't get me wrong. They're now 12th against opposing running backs in fantasy football. But nonetheless, those 2 matchups, I think, make Breece Hall a strong buy low candidate. And right now, so many fantasy managers just giving up on Breece Hall, who's had 12 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games. But on the season, he still has been very good. The RB13 so far on the year. And the buy low window is presenting itself, right? So I think it's just a strong time to go out and get Breece Hall while his perceived value is so low. And maybe he kind of sticks to like this 12-point type area for the rest of the season, the way that this Jets offense looks. But I'm not going to freak out about it. If you can buy Breece Hall at a low enough value, and then he has higher value through the fantasy playoffs, it is worth it. Now, a lot of people saying like, well, the Jets aren't in playoff contention, which they really needed to win this past week to stay in the playoff picture. I think there's technically still a chance if they win out. The playoff picture is a little crazy right now. I'm not banking on it either, guys, and I don't know how competitive these games are going to be, but nonetheless, I think Breece Hall will continue to be a player that can bring you a stable floor, and he has 2 fantastic matchups throughout the playoffs. And once again, with all of these things working against Breece Hall, that just makes his buy low window even more attractive because you're not giving up a ton to get Breece Hall. You're probably buying him at his lowest perceived value on the season. Keep in mind, he is a week 12 bye week, so if you want to wait and see how he looks this week against the Colts and then see if you can buy him during his bye week, you can try, but it's also going to depend on your respective league and when your trade deadline is. As for most leagues, the trade deadline is this week. So go on and buy Breece Hall. I truly don't think you guys are going to regret it, and I think he will help make a push in the fantasy playoffs to help you guys win your league this year. The final player that we're going to talk about is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. I'm trying to get Sutton on my roster before the trade deadline hits. He has a fantastic matchup here in Week 11 against the Atlanta Falcons. I do think he's a must-start player here in Week 11, so get him on your roster before Sunday. You're not buying low on Courtland Sutton. 17 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, coming off of a great game against the Chiefs and a bad matchup. He's a wide receiver 15 so far on the season, but I think Sutton could make a crucial push in the fantasy playoffs for you guys, facing the Colts in Week 15, giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. The Chargers in Week 16, not a great matchup there, but the last time he played the Chargers, he had a touchdown and 15.3 fantasy points. Then in Week 17, it's the Cincinnati Bengals, giving up the 20th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. The Broncos, one of these teams, if the playoffs ended today, they have a wild card spot. They're going to be fighting at the end of the season here for a wild card spot, for playoff seeding, all of that stuff, and they get good competitive matchups for the most part here, at least against the Chargers and the Cincinnati Bengals, who in their own right could be fighting for playoff seeding and wild card spots and all that stuff at the end of the season as well. So I like the game script overall for the most part here through the fantasy playoffs, and I love the matchups for Courtland Sutton as well, and he's quietly been very good in fantasy football. We date back to week 3. He's had 13.8 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 matchups. So go out, get Sutton on your roster now. He's a great start here in week 11, and he's going to be a fantastic start through the fantasy playoffs who could help you guys win your fantasy league in 2024. There you have it. There's today's video. There are 9 league winning moves that you guys need to make here in week 11 before that trade deadline hits or before those defenses get taken off of the waiver wires. So let's get into it, guys. If you need any help moving into week 11 of the fantasy season, be sure to drop me a comment down below. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Sunday's slate of games. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have everything that you could possibly need this week and for the remainder of the season on the channel to help you dominate your fantasy league. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.